Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Hey, Jake. I am very excited to present Peter Beinart. My name is Keith Gesson, by the way. I teach magazine journalism at the school, and I also run the Delacorte Center on the 8th floor, which puts on events about magazines once in a while, actually about 3 times a semester. And this is our first event of the fall, and I am very happy to present Peter Beinart, a distinguished journalist and political columnist and political thinker, author of books, most recently Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And we will talk for a bit, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, Peter, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yeah, you gotta flip that. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for having me. No? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great.
Peter, I thought we might just start with you talking a little bit about your background in your book. I actually didn't, I learned things from reading your book about you that I didn't know. So, yeah, just like where you grew up and how that has kind of influenced your thinking.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I always hope, like, I've been, given a bunch of book talks now, and I always hope that there are people in the audience who really disagree with me, because I find one of the most difficult things about this debate for me, and a lot of debates in American politics, is that people often just tend to come to listen to those with whom they already agree. So if you're the person, if you hear things that you really, really strongly disagree with, I want to say that I'm really grateful that you're here. I think that one of my favorite lines from the Talmud is from a section called Pirkei Avot, where it says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." And I always feel like the people who are willing to actually go out of their way to expose themselves to perspectives that challenge them show a lot of wisdom. I think my parents emigrated to the United States from South Africa just before I was born. And I think that in my childhood, my parents were still, their world was still South Africa in a lot of ways, and it was also a very intense time in South African politics, from the Soweto massacre in the late 70s into the state of emergency of the 1980s as I was kind of starting to grow up. And I think that the debate about Israel and about being Jewish was often framed by different competing narratives, I would say, in my family about apartheid South Africa. So, and so, on the one hand, I was very proud of my parents that they had left apartheid South Africa and that they had been involved in anti-apartheid activism. But I think I thought more and more about that in relationship to Israel as I got older, and reflected on how many of the arguments that I hear today about Israel remind me of the arguments that I used to hear about South Africa from my extended family. And I feel in some ways very grateful that I grew up in a place where I heard arguments for a system of group supremacy. And because I was in that context, those arguments now people look back on and think, those insane racists, how could they possibly ever have defended apartheid? But for me, because I understood the milieu, I understood why it was very plausible for them to think a certain theories of things. So in some ways, the example of apartheid would naturally cut against the idea of a system like Israel's, which gives one group superior legal rights over another. But on the other hand, the fact that the Jews in South Africa felt fragile, felt uncertain of their place more than Jews in the United States did or do, actually made the South African Jewish community more Zionistic than the American Jewish community. I mean, American Jews think of themselves as pretty Zionistic, but actually, I think most other significant diaspora Jewish communities are more Zionistic than the American Jewish community is, because they feel somewhat less integrated into the host society. And that was particularly true during apartheid South Africa, where in a way, a lot of Jews felt like they were there somewhat accidentally. Many of them had literally come to South Africa because the United States closed its doors in 1921, and they ended up in South Africa. But there was a very, very strong sense that this country's is part of a struggle between basically blacks and Afrikaners for power, and we just happen to be here, but our hearts are in Israel. In fact, one of the big books about South African Jews is not called The Jews of South Africa, it's called The Jews in South Africa, as if they were kind of like passing through. And this particularly for my grandmother, who had her own particular story because her family was from the Isle of Rhodes and from Izmir in Turkey, and she was born in Alexandria in Egypt, and then family moved to the Belgian Congo, of all places, and then to South Africa. She who was I dedicate the book to her, she used to tell me constantly that there was no safety in South Africa, there was no safety in America. She very much disliked it when I showed any signs of American kind of patriotism and telling her how great things were in America. And she constantly basically said, Israel is the only place that you can put any sense of trust and security. So for some people who were in my family who were very influential for me, actually, their experience to South Africanness was an experience that led them to a very, very intense sense of connection to Israel. Whereas in retrospect, I think that, and what it's fascinating, and I'll end here, but the debate over Israel and South Africa today is a really interesting one. It's an extremely intense debate in which basically, because there's such a strong anti-Israel politics in South Africa because it's seen through the lens of the experience. But the Jewish community, the mainstream of the Jewish community, has really doubled down into an even more intense form of supporting Israel. And the South African Jews who are anti-Israel, who tend to be the ones who were very deeply connected to the African National Congress and the Communist Party, remain very, very alienated from the mainstream Jewish community. And that, for me, also offers a model of the thing that I have often feared in my own life, which is I felt like certainly for the last 15 years of my life, I've been trying to figure out whether I could live a life in which I could be a very strong public critic of Israel and still live in a kind of traditional Jewish community. And sometimes I feel like it's a weekly referendum on that question when I show up into shul, kind of like how well it's going,
So you are somewhat, well, you tell me how unique this is, but there aren't that many Jews, public Jews on the left who are as religious. You're Orthodox.
Yeah, that means different things to different people. So I would say I go to a synagogue that is Orthodox, and I try my best to do certain things that one would associate with Orthodoxy. Yeah, like observing Shabbat and daily prayer and keeping kosher. Yeah. And
did you grow up?
No, I didn't. I grew up my family was more like traditional in the way that South African Jews were traditional, which was kind of like there were certain traditional practices, so we had to kind of stay home on Friday night. We had to have a Shabbat dinner, which everyone in South Africa kind of did, even though they weren't actually observing Shabbat. So my mother had a certain kind of, I would say, traditionalism that was common to South African Jews of her generation. And my decision to become more observant actually partly emerged in my 20s from a realization that my mother's vision of Jewish life didn't really work in America, basically. Like that there was really America is not a place where you can, to me, I began to feel like the things that I liked about the experience that I had when I was in South Africa and in my home basically would not be possible in the United States without a stronger communal infrastructure and a stronger sense of kind of like religious commandedness, because there are not actually that many Americans who have a regular Shabbat dinner who don't actually observe Shabbat as well. So that was part of what moved me ultimately into a more religious life.
And then, so the thing that I did know about you, and I want to ask you about, I became aware of you as the editor of the New Republic. I'm old enough to remember the New Republic. It still exists, but not quite the same way. And this is a magazine. You went to Yale. You were a Rhodes Scholar. You became an assistant editor, and then you became the editor at a fairly young age. A magazine that was owned by Marty Peretz, who was a very strong, vehement supporter of Israel. New Republic occupied this kind of liberal, but very supportive of Israel position. And you have moved very far from that position in the last 20 years. So how did that happen? Did you have a sudden conversion? Did you have a gradual conversion? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I had a couple of different kinds of conversions. I mean, I came to the New Republic in the 1990s at a kind of, you could say, high point of American, I wouldn't have put it in those terms now, but a kind of imperial self-confidence that I think I was very much caught up in, and then, the New Republic was known as this kind of liberal hawkish publication. It had supported, it had taken a relatively hawkish position during the Cold War compared to the Democratic Party. It had supported interventions in the wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and then in Iraq. And I was the editor when we did that, which was evidence probably that I shouldn't have been editor. Although probably, frankly, anyone who had been editor would have taken that position because it was the magazine's legacy of this kind of very, very hawkish form of liberalism, which turned out to be an utter catastrophe. And so I think the first thing for me, even before Israel-Palestine, was that I realized pretty soon by 2004, certainly by 2005, that my whole template for thinking about the world was fundamentally flawed and was producing catastrophic consequences for not just for for the country, for the Middle East. There were also Michael Kelly, who had been my boss at the New Republic, was someone I really, really looked up to, died in covering the Iraq War. I had a close family member who was deployed and had to leave her very small children to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the first thing that as I left the New Republic, I realized that I wasn't really going to be able to write at all about foreign policy and America's role in the world unless I really rethought things in a really fundamental way, because it wasn't just that I had been wrong about Iraq. It was, it was just that the whole set of underlying ideas that had led me to support Iraq had to be rethought. So I kind of left the New Republic and I wrote basically two books trying to grapple, particularly the second one, trying to grapple with this question of hubris in American foreign policy and why I had been so susceptible to it, but also looking at previous examples. I also think it was then having that distance from the New Republic allowed me to start to think more independently about Israel and Palestine, because the magazine had such a strong identity on that question, and I didn't really write about it very much. And I had the experience of around that time of going to the West Bank for the first time, and it's really, in retrospect, kind of ridiculous that it took me into my early 30s to go to the West Bank, given that I had been going to Israel since I was a kid. But I think, and this is this is an experience that many others have had as well. It's not unique to me, but I think that first day that I spent in the West Bank made me realize that I really needed to rethink a lot of things. I think there were several things that occurred to me in that experience that were very destabilizing. The first thing was that I thought of myself as someone who knew quite a bit about Israel, because it had been a background noise in my life my entire life. I had spent time there. I'd been at this publication that was obsessed with Israel, and I realized that I knew something about what Israel meant. I knew something about Jewish Israel, and I knew something about what Israel meant within a Jewish story, and I might have been able to name the parties in the Knesset, or that kind of thing. But I knew very little about what Israel was like, what it meant to be a Palestinian under Israeli control. Like what Edward Said said, what Edward Said called Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. So first of all, I just realized that I actually knew very little about what Israel's system of control over Palestinians was like. The second thing I realized was that this system was much more brutal and terrifying than I had understood. I mean, I think if you'd asked me, I would have said, it's not great, it's unfortunate, it's really too bad. I would love to see there be a Palestinian state, but I would have given various kind of caveats about how, the Palestinians bear some responsibility for this, and there are difficult security questions. But honestly, I found that on the ground, a lot of that stuff just started to evaporate because there was so much that could not be justified by any reasonable security concern, unless you just see Palestinians as inherently a security threat. And also just that, and again, I think this is a result of my own privilege. I mean, I had not grown up in a situation where I had ever lived under a state that was totally unaccountable to me. And I think as I talk to people who described kind of mundane aspects of their life, living under the control of a state that had life and death power over them, but basically where they had no voice in the state whatsoever. Because if you're in the West Bank, you can't vote for the Israeli government. You're under military law. You can't become a citizen. So, it's like other situations, whether it's being black under apartheid or black under Jim Crow. The state can take whatever it wants from you if it decides it wants to take it from you. And your neighbors who are of a different racial or ethnic group, who have citizenship, can take what they want from you, and in any interaction, you lose. And so if the state wants to take your time, or if it wants to take your property, or if it wants to take some aspects of your dignity, or if it wants to take your freedom or your life, it can do so, and there's really very little you can do. And that experience of seeing how terrifying that was for people was destabilizing to me. And the third thing that was destabilizing to me, and most, I would say, difficult to admit, was that as I began interacting with Palestinians, and that was the beginning of a process, I would say, of learning from Palestinians that continues to this day, I was surprised that the Palestinians I was interacting with did not conform to the stereotypes that I had about Palestinians. None of the people I met seemed to have any particular desire to kill Jews or even to hate Jews just because they were Jews, and they were just, whatever. They had all the same range of characteristics that any other human beings would have had. And I realized that I was not really prepared for that because even though I thought of myself as relatively liberal, I had grown up in this typical Jewish way where from your earliest moments, you're hearing about Palestinians in this vaguely menacing way, but you're not actually listening to Palestinians and encountering Palestinians. And I think that is a recipe for dehumanization. And it leads you to all of these kind of racist ideas, even if they're not entirely conscious, they're kind of in the back of your mind. So I would say that was the beginning for me of realizing that I was really going to need to rethink things. I don't think I would have been able to predict that I would have gone, as we might say in Jewish parlance, as far off the derech, or the path as I have, but it was a process that began then.
And so when, can you keep telling that story? So when did you, 2000, for me in public, it happens in 2010, you published this piece in the New York Review of Books talking about the failure of the American Jewish establishment and the fact, which I think may have been over-optimistic, the idea that young Jews have entirely rejected this narrative. But yeah, can you talk about, was that difficult? What was the reaction?
I think that I think for me, one of the things that led me to that when Obama was elected and Netanyahu returned to being Israel's prime minister at roughly the same time in 2009, it seemed to me there was a very clear, choice for American Jews in terms of these two people representing fundamentally different principles and belief systems, and both of them in a way, appealing to a certain kind of Jewish narrative, right? And as it became very clear to me that the power centers in the organized American Jewish community would line up very strongly with Netanyahu against Obama, and also I think at the same time that I was starting to have kids in a kind of Orthodox Jewish community, I began to feel it became clear to me that that it was becoming harder and harder to pretend that one could maintain one's kind of liberal principles while also being a supporter of what Israel was doing. That people were trying to pretend these two things were compatible, but it seemed to me more and more obvious that they were in very, very deep tension, and that there was a choice that people would have to make. And I think I worried, even as my kids are very little, about how they would navigate that difficulty, how it would be possible, given that the way the organized American Jewish community works is that the definition of what it means to be a Jew in good standing is very often to support the state of Israel, and that's often what's expected if you're in a tightly knit Jewish community. I worried how my kids could both have that experience that was important to me, and that I hoped that they would have in their lives, but also actually, be a believer in basic principles of liberalism and human rights. And I do think actually what's happened since then is that tension has just become more and more and more acute, and more and more and more obvious. And I did feel that in 2010 I was starting to see the beginnings of something which is now much, much bigger, which is not all young American Jews, maybe not even most, but a very substantial wing of particularly young American Jews are basically defecting from the kind of the narrative about Israel that they were raised with. And I actually find it very, very, to me, it's an enormous source of hope, in this kind of moment of terrible, terrible evil that we see around us, both here and in Israel, Palestine. And I would say over time, I began to feel that the position that I wanted to hold, which was a position that imagined there could be partition between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, that itself started to feel more and more false to me, that it began to feel to me like I was still trying to preserve certain things about the worldview that I had grown up with, because I was afraid to kind of peel the onion even further. I was like, I've already... it was for a number of years, I think it was too difficult for me to imagine ever not actually supporting a Jewish state. Just being very, very publicly and openly critical of Israel was enough. But over time, I got to another point where I felt like my writing was just starting to feel very false to me. I mean, I was kind of one of these people who kept on saying, like, the two-state solution is dying. You can't continue to build settlements and think that you can create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And I remember a Palestinian friend once said to me, Peter, he said, nothing can be perpetually dying. At some point it's dead. And I realized that the reason that I wasn't willing to face that question was that I wasn't willing to actually think outside of that paradigm, because I knew that it would mean having to basically question the entire idea of a state that is run by Jews, but that once I started really grappling with writing that thought about Israel and Palestine outside of the paradigm of separation, but within a paradigm of equality, I actually found it quite liberating, and it made me feel like, in a way, I was able to there were certain things that I had been not willing to look at, that I felt like it gave me the conspectual space to look in the eye. One of which was, to spend a lot of time thinking about the question of Palestinian refugees and what happened in 1948, and be able to recognize that, that I had no moral argument for why Palestinian refugees could not return, and I had to support the right of Palestinian refugees to return.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of this? The effects, whether in your personal life or at synagogue, of you becoming a public, such a public critic of Israel and a supporter ultimately of a one-state solution.
I think the first thing that's just important for me to say is that the consequences that I face are very, very, very minimal, compared to the consequences that, obviously, we've just watched, maybe 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza being killed. Maybe the numbers will be higher. Basically, the destruction of an entire territory. More child amputees than any other place on earth. Something which is now, I think, been widely accepted as a genocide. So, and even if I compare the consequences that I face to many people in the United States, many people have lost their jobs or been expelled or suspended or all kinds of things. I have immense privilege in this conversation as an American citizen, born here, Jewish, a professor with tenure. All of these things essentially in some ways make me feel like I'm so relatively insulated from the kind of consequences that even just I just watch the way people respond to even just the. I watch the way people respond to people who say similar things to me, if those people are not white and Jewish and male and straight, and the response is so much fiercer than it is to me that I'm often reminded that, like, I get off really, really easily. There are definitely people who used to be close. They're definitely close friends of mine who are not close friends of mine anymore, and that's hard because I still have a lot of care and love for those people, and it's hard for me to know that they walk around thinking that I am someone who is trying to do them harm, or to do that I'm trying to do the harm to them and their families, because I know that some of those people really do believe that about me, and I wish I could say to them, no, I really care about you. I actually really care about the welfare and safety of the Jewish people very intensely. That's a big part of the reason I do this. You can believe that I'm wrong and that my arguments are wrong, but accept that my motivations are actually come from a place of care and solidarity and love. But I often don't succeed in convincing people of that, I'm afraid. But I think that I've found that I've tried to remind myself that none of us really have a lot of control over what other people think and do. And so to me, I think the thing that I've tried to think more about is, if I put myself in a situation in which a lot of people think that I have violated some core understanding of what it means to be a Jew, I may not be able to answer them, but I need to answer myself. So I need to think for myself, how do I answer that? And so I think that for me, probably one reason that I think, not the main reason, but one reason I decided 5.5 years ago to do this thing called Daf Yomi, where I study a page of Talmud every day, was I kind of wanted to be able to have some practice in my own life where it was not a thing I was saying to other people, but I wanted to be able to say to myself, this is an act of Jewish commitment for me that to me is a way of a way of connecting to and showing solidarity with being Jewish in a way that's much, much, much deeper to me, much more ancient, and I think much more enduring ultimately than this ethno-nationalist project, which I really believe has been kind of putting that at the center of what it means to be Jewish. I think has been actually quite disastrous for Judaism, kind of ethically, but I also just think it's spiritually a dead end. And so I think it's led me to think that I really need to invest in other ways of other forms of Jewish commitment that don't run through a system of Jewish supremacy.
So let's talk about that. We're here at Columbia. It's a place that had very loud and boisterous protests.
Yeah, so I heard, yeah.
Yes. And if we were sitting here, a year and a half ago, we would hear them out the window, and a year and 6 months, about a year and a half ago, the encampments were on the lawn, and they were passionate. There were many Jewish students at those encampments, and the reaction to them was, frankly, to me, astonishingly fierce, right? And it came both from the political right, for sure, but also from people who I think thought of themselves as liberal Jews, who felt like they were being attacked and threatened in a way that, to me, just didn't. People would call me, right, and say, "Are you okay? Are you safe at Columbia?" Right, and I felt very safe at Columbia. How do you kind of think about that? Like, what happened to where are those people coming from?
I mean, I wasn't, unlike many of you, I wasn't here, so I want to be careful. And I also know, just from talking to lots of people, that people often have very different kinds of experiences. So I'll offer some thoughts based on things that I've noticed talking to students, Jewish students at different universities, and maybe they will, and sometimes at Columbia too. I think the first thing is that the fundamental problem with trying to answer this question, like how much anti-Semitism was there in the Columbia encampment or in the Columbia pro-Palestinian movement, is we just don't have a consensus definition of anti-Semitism. We have different people have radically different definitions of anti-Semitism, right? And it basically divides along this line of, do you think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? If you think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, there was a lot of anti-Semitism at Columbia, right? In fact, if you believe anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, we have a big anti-Semitism problem among American Jews, right? Because, I mean, the Washington Post just reported that 39% of American Jews think that Israel's committed genocide, right? And if you ask Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League, that's a pretty good indicator that you have some anti-Semitic beliefs. So, I sometimes think that maybe we should start with trying to combat the anti-Semitism problem in our own families and in our own communities, because that's actually, it's one of the places where it seems to be bubbling up. I mean, I think that there is one thing that I think has happened is that it has been a really traumatic experience for many, many American Jewish families to realize that in a very short period of time, many American institutions, including particularly universities, but others to which they felt very, very connected, went from places where you could be very openly pro-Israel and without really anyone giving you a hard time about it, to those institutions becoming the equivalent of basically being pro-Israel is like being anti-abortion or anti-LGBT rights, or basically it's like being a conservative Republican. You're going to be, if people are going to think your views are not just wrong, but like really morally objectionable, and they may not want to be your friends. And I've been struck by how much in the Columbia Anti-Semitism Task Force report and in the Harvard report are about the question of social exclusion. I mean, like a lot of the examples they're talking about are of social exclusion, and I think that I'm sympathetic to those Jewish kids who are socially excluded. I don't actually think that excluding them is a good way of handling these situations. I mean, I really like Naomi Klein's line where she says you should be tough on systems and soft on people. If people come out of the kind of environments that, of my own kids, Jewish day schools and others, these are, many Jewish kids, not all, but many are coming environments where they were presented a view of Israel that's intimate and precious and very deeply, emotionally bound for them. And it doesn't do, and to basically say, fuck you, settler colonialist, this is not going to be convincing to them. And it's just not, I don't think it should be banned, of course, but I don't think it's actually a productive way. And I would say the same thing about, imagine a South Asian kid coming out of a family where people think Narendra Modi and Hindutva is great, right? I don't see that excluding that kid. I think what we want to do is create as many opportunities for actually genuine intellectual engagement, right? For people to learn. So that's one element of it. But I think that dynamic of feeling that all of a sudden you have a very unpopular ideological position is really not the same as, is really not anti-Semitism for me. It doesn't mean that I like all the ways in which it's expressed, but I don't think that's anti-Semitism. I do think sometimes there is anti-Semitism in the sense that people conflate Jews and Israel. So like, I've heard people say things like, they said that they don't want to be friends with me because I'm a Zionist. And I said, well, how do you know I'm a Zionist? They said, well, we saw you wearing a kippah down the street, right? And so I think that does represent a real problem, right? It's very important that American Jews not be held responsible for what Israel does any more than we would hold Chinese Americans responsible for what the government of China does. The problem with combating that conflation, though, is that the American Jewish institutions that repeatedly insist, right, that to be Jewish, that to be a supporter of Israel, to be a Zionist, is inherent in being Jewish, right? So you are actually making exactly the conflation that you then object to when people who don't like Israel and Zionism make that conflation, right? I think the other thing about the discourse that the things about the discourse that I find very, very really annoy me and I find very upsetting is, first of all, this sense that you find in Jewish spaces that a lot of people who have been arguing for a long time that like other minority groups should toughen up and listen to difficult opinions and basically not be snowflakes and not have safe spaces and be willing to be open debate and that speech isn't violence and all these things. Actually, I think there's a lot of truth in all that. And then it like completely goes out the window when it comes to us, right? And I think that's just, I mean, I just think it has really made me much less willing to believe that those people, some people who went to this university who spent a lot of time making those arguments, I just don't think they were sincere. I think they're just tribalists. They basically want one set of rules for other groups and another set of rules for us. And I think that universities should be places where you're made intellectually uncomfortable. Like, that's the point of going to university, right? And that should apply to Jewish students just like it should apply to every other group of students. And then the last point that I find really, I think, is really deeply problematic is if you're going to be concerned about the rights and safety and feelings about Jewish students, you need to be exactly equally concerned about the rights and safety of Palestinian students. And yet, for me, there was very, very, very little concern about the rights and safety and feelings of Palestinian students at all. So, like, when people often say, well, like, we need to think about how the Jewish students feel when someone says globalize the Intifada or Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, right? And I would say we should think, because those globalized Intifada could be interpreted as supporting violence against Jews, right? And I would say we should treat someone saying globalize the Intifada in exactly the same way as we should treat someone who says Israel has the right to defend itself, or I stand with the IDF, which are also statements that actually are supportive of violence against Palestinians, right? And yet the one phrase basically causes a huge national kind of a communal uproar, and the other basically doesn't occasion any debate at all. And it's just this like, there's this assumption, I think, so often that Jewish students are entitled to a level of kind of protection that is not due to their Palestinian peers, and that seems to me to violate the principle of equality under the law and of equality of human dignity that we should actually be fighting for here.
And we are undergoing at the same time a real crisis, I think, in Jewish American life, in the way that, and I just wonder if you'll talk about it for a minute, like in the way that you described yourself having a sort of double consciousness a little bit, right? On the one hand, I'm a liberal. On the other hand, I still believe that, Israel will partition will have a two-state solution, and it seems like we've entered, for the last 2 years, we've been in this crisis of this kind of dual ideas could no longer be held in one's head at the same time, right? You're either liberal or you're a supporter of Israel, and it seems like very difficult to be both.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think more and more people are recognizing that, and it's very, very painful for many people to, especially older American Jews, I think, because there is this profound contradiction, right? That American Jewish politics has generally been based on the idea, certain American Jewish life has been kind of based on the idea that we should be a country that treats people equally, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. Certainly American Jews have benefited enormously from the progress that America made in that direction in the second half of the 20th century. And yet the same people who would be, who would find the idea of a white Christian supremacist state horrifying, also believe that they should that also support the idea of a Jewish supremacist state. And I think that contradiction is really, really coming to the fore in a lot of really important ways. One way in which it's coming to the fore is that it's become more, Israel has become, over the last decade or two, more and more a model for ethno-nationalists around the world, right? So many people in Europe, in the Republican Party, in the United States, in India, basically want to fashion their states after Israel. They want a technologically and economically dynamic state in which one group has kind of tribal supremacy over another, right? And so it's like you want to make an exception. as Jews, you kind of say, we generally believe in the idea of equality under the law, but we need to make an exception for Israel because, we're a small group of people and we've had a really, really rough history, so we can't afford to accept, that principle can't apply in Israel and Palestine. But then the exception you make, it turns out, doesn't stay in Israel and Palestine. Turns out a lot of other people want to make that exception as well, right? And I think that's one of the ways in which this contradiction actually blows back into the United States, right? And to me, and so what you see is a kind of Jewish institutions, let's say the Anti-Defamation League, for instance, right, which has long tried to hold this contradictory position. It's supposedly a civil rights organization in the United States, but it's a position that defends Jewish supremacy in Israel. It actually is forced to choose, right? Because people like Zoran Mamdani kind of force it to choose. Zoran Mamdani says, hey, I don't like ethno-nationalism. I don't like Modi. I don't like Trump. I don't like Israel's system of Jewish supremacy. I'm against all of it, right? And so, and then on the other hand, you have Donald Trump, who says, Israel's terrific. Let's create a system of white Christian supremacy like Israel's. And so it kind of puts an organization like the Anti-Defamation League on the spot. And lo and behold, what do you find? That the Anti-Defamation League creates, like just yesterday, right, like a tracking system, right, to basically track all of the appointees in the Mamdani administration because they represent a threat to Jews, where they haven't done that with Trump, right? I mean, I saw these rabbis after rabbis. I have to say, the statements by the rabbis, to me, were particularly most offensive. What was disturbing about me was particularly that they were given on Shabbat, and they were then tried to reference often the weekly Torah portion. I was like, listen, if you're going to make a political advertisement for Andrew Cuomo, please, why do you have to bring the Parsha into it? Why does it have to be on Shabbat? Just make your statement, right? And but none of and I also was wondering, sorry, but what's the justification under Jewish law for basically that you can violate Shabbat in order to make a campaign promo commercial for Andrew Cuomo? What is that considered pekuach nefesh, saving a life? I thought, but it was also none of these people have expressed this level. I mean, the rabbi of there's a very prominent Orthodox rabbi on the East Side who just put out a statement yesterday saying that he feels like he's living in the 1930s, right? And I'm thinking, have any of these rabbis actually expressed this level of alarm about Donald Trump? I mean, the irony, you have actually a kind of more and more evidence that that many leaders in the organized American Jewish community care more about maintaining a system of Jewish supremacy in Israel than they do in maintaining liberal democracy in the United States, right? And putting even aside from the morality of that, these people really think that American Jews are going to fare well in a white Christian ethno-state? I think actually the evidence suggests very, very clearly, right? And it didn't, and it started this, and this evidence was there long before the last, before Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens. You can go back and look at years and years of data suggests that anti-Semitic attitudes travel very closely with anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT, anti-black, anti-immigrant sentiment, right? It is not surprising at all that a lot of these people who are anti-Muslim bigots and anti-black and anti-immigrant, that they don't like Jews very much as well, right? And those are the people that you have basically gotten into bed with. The people who are your best allies in protecting Jewish safety in the United States are people like Zoran Mamdani, because they have a principled commitment to the idea of that people should be treated equally, irrespective of their religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. And the people who have a principled commitment to that are people who you can rely on in this struggle. But the organized American Jewish community has severed this fight against anti-Semitism from a larger fight for the principle of equality under the law and for a struggle against bigotry in general. And I think it's immoral, and I think it's also incredibly foolish.
There's a mic back there if people want to stand up and ask a question, or you can just kind of shout it out. That's also okay. Do you want to shout it out?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
Firstly, it's terrific.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This question is going well already. Yeah.
But I will say one thing that I disagree with a tiny. But a year ago, I would have say this, you know, the Jews need a country of their own. I think coming out of the Holocaust, especially, when not only the Nazis, but all of the world, people were turning the Jews away.
Right,
Even
right.
we turned the Jews away.
Yes.
Okay, so that was, when I was a little girl, that was told to me as the reason why we must never forget, and
Yes.
Israel has to be there because there has to be one safe haven for the Jews.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the only reason
Yeah.
I could see why there should be a Jewish state.
Yes.
Otherwise, I agree with everything you're saying. It
Yes.
should be a Jewish supremacist state.
Yeah.
But isn't that true that there should be a Jewish state?
I really appreciate you asking that, and I think that what you're saying is the way I felt. And I will say there's still a voice inside my head that says those things to me. The reason I think that I have, the reason I don't think those things anymore, beyond the fact that I just don't think I can be, I think that I can't oppose systems of groups, racial, religious, ethnic supremacy, and make an exception for my own group. If I make an exception for my own group, then I don't actually hold that principle, right? But beyond that, I don't actually think a system of Jewish supremacy is the best way to keep Jews safe. Because actually, Israel is actually the most dangerous place for Jews of any large-scale Jewish community in the world. And I think the reason is that systems of supremacy impose a great deal of violence on people who are legal inferiors. Now, the violence may be sometimes hidden, but these are systems of tremendous violence on the people who don't have basic rights in the state. And those systems of violence, I think, ultimately make everyone less safe. I mean, think about how much more dangerous life would be like for white Southerners if black Southerners had not gotten the vote in 1965, right? Because when you get the vote, you have a nonviolent mechanism of having the government listen to you. If you don't have the vote, you have very little nonviolent mechanism of having the government listen to you. And I think you can even see this in Israel itself, which is that Israeli Jews, who are generally, many of them, very frightened to go into the West Bank, let alone Gaza, because they think those people are so dangerous, they go into hospitals all the time in Israel and are operated on by Palestinian doctors and nurses, and then they go get their medicines from Palestinian pharmacists, right? And they call them Arab Israelis, right? But they're just the Palestinians who managed to not get expelled in 1948, right? And they don't have any higher opinion of Zionism than the Palestinians who got expelled to Gaza and the West Bank, right? But even though they suffer tremendous amounts of discrimination, they are still citizens, right? They're not under military law, and it gives them a different incentive structure, right? Whereas if they have some mechanism to try to have a decent life, with that, and to have the government respond to them. Whereas in the West, when we saw in 2018 when Palestinians in Gaza tried to march nonviolently to the fence that separates them from Israel, they were just shot by the thousands, right? They have no mechanism to try to appeal to the government. And so I really believe that systems of legal equality produce greater safety for everyone. And I think the academic literature that I've looked at shows this, that armed conflict is more likely to break out in divided societies when one group is locked out of political power.
You have a nice quote at the end of your book from Mahmoud Mamdani to that
Yes.
effect. Yes, Columbia professor.
Yes, right. And it really spoke to me because he speaks about the necklace, right? Which was this thing that, people have turned the ANC into a Gandhian organization. The ANC, African National Congress, was not nonviolent. Nelson Mandela helped to transform the ANC into an organization that believed in armed resistance, and some of their greatest violence was actually committed against people they accused of being collaborators, so there was this thing called the necklace, where basically if you were accused of being a collaborator in South Africa in the 1980s, they would put a tire around your neck filled with gasoline and light it on fire. And that sure as heck scared a lot of white South Africans, especially after Winnie Mandela and Nelson Mandela's wife said that with the necklace we will liberate this country, right? Which is a pretty terrifying statement for whites to hear. And Mahmoud Mamdani asked the question, what happened to necklacing? after apartheid ended? What happened to Mkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC, which white South Africans felt was terrifying and which the US government considered a terrorist organization? And the answer was that Mkhonto we Sizwe, just like the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, had no reason to continue its armed struggle once you had political equality and the right to vote. And so actually, white South Africans were also much safer today than they would have been if you'd had another 25, 30 years of apartheid.
David.
Hi. There has been a quantifiable increase in anti-Semitic violent incidents in Europe and America. If you look at the killing of Sarah Milgram and her husband, you look at the Manchester synagogue attack, I could go on.
Yeah.
How should American Jewry respond to that?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think I agree that anti-Semitism is rising, and I think it's rising in two different ways. I think it's rising, and including violence. It's rising on the right because I think it's connected to the weakening and collapse of liberal democracy itself, right? And that you have you have basically people who have a kind of white supremacist view that leads them to have hostile views to Muslims, to Jews, to all kinds of groups that are considered outsider groups. So, for instance, in the Pittsburgh shooting, for instance, that guy was radicalized by watching Fox News tell him that America was being invaded by caravans from Central America, but then he decided the Jews were behind it because there is this kind of racist myth which goes back a long way that basically black and brown people can't organize themselves, and so they need Jews to do it for them. That's why segregationists thought that the Jewish communists were running the civil rights movement, and white South Africans thought that Joe Slovo, the head of the South African Communist Party, was running the ANC. So that's one version. The other version is, I think, people taking out their anger at what's happening in Israel against Jews. And that is also rising. And there's evidence, there's studies that I've seen in Belgium, Australia, and the United States that show a correlation between Israeli violence against Palestinians and increases in anti-Semitic incidents around the world. And so that's also very frightening. And I want to make it clear, the correlation does not mean that people are not responsible for their anti-Semitism. People who attack Jews in the name of, because they're expressing their anger at what Israel's doing, are committing anti-Semitic incidents, just like someone who expresses their anger at the Chinese government's policies on COVID or whatever, and then attacks a Chinese person, is responsible for what they're doing. I think the way to answer this is to be clear that Jews are not responsible for what the state of Israel is doing, and that if you have a problem with the state of Israel, you have a problem with the state of Israel, not with the Jews who go to the synagogue down the street, right? And I think we have to demand that people who don't like Israel, that they maintain that and are clear about this distinction. But we're not going to be effective in asking them to do that if the organized Jewish community is not willing to make that distinction itself, right? The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom said a few years ago that Zionism, not the word Zion, which is an ancient word for Israel and Jerusalem, but Zionism leaps from every page of the Siddur, of the Jewish prayer book, right? Now, that's a very, very problematic thing to say, right? You're essentially saying that the Jewish prayer book is a Zionist document. And then what are you going to, then when someone says, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go write Free Palestine on a bunch of Jewish prayer books, you're going to be upset at that person. But you are actually making the very conflation that we don't want those people to make.
First of all, thank you for coming here. I read your book, and it drastically improved my relationship with my grandfather, as you could imagine. Something I've wondered is, with Zoran's victory, it's a bit of a lab test for a lot of what you've put forward in your books, that the idea of secular democracy and belief in those systems is the solution to anti-Semitism. I agree with the premise. How do you think Zoran or the upcoming city government can implement a set of policies to combat anti-Semitism within that framework?
I think that it's important for Mamdani to keep saying, because most Jewish New Yorkers do identify as Zionists, and he's an anti-Zionist, right? And many of those those Jewish New Yorkers who identify as Zionism see Zionism as, the thing is that he sees a clear distinction between being Jewish and being a Zionist, but many of them don't, right? Which is why they think of him as hostile, right? And so I think he's done a pretty good job of it, but he needs to relentlessly keep trying to find ways of showing those people that for him those two things are different, right? He may never convince them that those things are different, but I think it's important that he keep trying to do that and keep trying and keep making it clear that his moral opposition to their support for a position of Jewish supremacy doesn't in any way mean that he doesn't feel that they are entitled to all the same rights and safety. I mean, it's the same thing as if someone was a big defender of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, right? They still have absolutely every right to be a New Yorker and to be safe and to be treated with dignity. Even lots of people have political views that, some people in the city even support Donald Trump, right? I think Mamdani needs to kind of keep finding ways of doing that. It's really actually interesting to see the way that different parts of the organized American Jewish community are operating. I mean, it was fascinating because I think that for some people, the connection between supporting Israel and Jewish safety are inextricably intertwined, right? In groups like the Anti-Defamation League. But if you look at the reaction from Mamdani from some of the leaders of the Satmar Hasidim, right? And Satmar Hasids are actually certainly in more danger, right, of being on the receiving end of anti-Semitism than the folks who hang out at the ADL, right? They're much more visibly Jewish, and for various reasons. But actually, the Satmar Hasidim are much more transactional in their relationship with Mamdani, and they're much more able to actually make a distinction between what they feel like they need and to be safe and and to thrive in New York from their views of the state of Israel. I mean, that has something to do with the fact that the Satmar believe that Zionism is a form of religious heresy. It's satanic. But it just makes the point that some of the Jewish New Yorkers are actually at the greatest risk, are actually very able to distinguish these two things. And Mamdani has to keep trying to do those things to make it clear that that he sees those two things as separate, even if some Jews in New York don't.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here. My name is Perry Univ. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a dual citizen with America and Israel. My family is Moroccan Jews, and I think my question might be a little too meta to be answered in this form, but one of the questions I've always had, and I think things that I've struggled with my lifetime here, is that oftentimes Jews are themselves conflated and identified in sort of tandem with sort of what we would consider the Ashkenazi tribe, the European Jew, and that within Judaism there is, I think, a great deal of racism and sort of xenophobia. And in the course of my lifetime, visiting my Israeli family, I watched Israel become more international, and the experience that a lot of immigrating sects or tribes, or however you want to call them, have faced great hurdles in acclimating to Israel as a new home. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that in terms of how that, in my mind or in my experience, is always pointed towards the sort of need, the survivalism that I think latching onto European identities has allowed Israel to sort of develop the way it has. Yeah. And I think that has also led to the perception of fear from Palestinians, from a number of other immigrating peoples that oftentimes are identifying as Jewish, even Arab Jews.
Yes.
And if you could, I guess, speak a little more to what that feels like, because I think oftentimes we do think, when we say Jews, we're thinking of white European Jews.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, there's so much there, and again, there are people who understand this much more deeply than me. But there's a great book by the Iraqi, Israeli, British journalist Rachel Shabi called "We Look Like the Enemy," right? Which is a great book of journalism about Mizrahi Jews, right? And about this dynamic in which people who came, like my grandmother's brother who came from Egypt, who came to Israel at a time when it was particularly where there was a tremendous amount of racism towards Jews from the Middle East. I mean, Ben-Gurion did not imagine this state being populated by people from Yemen and Morocco and Iraq. In fact, for him, one of the great tragedies of the Holocaust was that it actually it destroyed so many of the people that he imagined, the Europeans who would populate the state. Instead, I mean, he got Europeans, but what he ended up with getting a lot of people from the Arab and Muslim world, and many Ashkenazi Jews had views about those people were not so different than other Europeans had about them, right? Which was that they needed to be civilized, they were backward, and so. I think the tragedy, I mean, what many people, Ella Shohat famously wrote about, Zionism from the standpoint of its Jewish victims. I mean, they're Yehuda Shenhav. I mean, there's a whole list of, right now there's a brilliant Israeli writer named Orly Noy, who was born in Iran, who's the head of B'Tselem, who writes. There are many people who have written about this, about the way in which, in order to prove themselves in a very, very racist Israel, that Arab Jews who had to become more anti-Arab than European Jews in order to prove their Jewishness, right? And I think that's been the dynamic ever since. I mean, one of the points that Orly Noy made to me, which I thought was really interesting, was we had a conversation about this group called the Black Panthers that existed, of mostly Moroccan immigrants to Israel, who created this group called the Black Panthers against basically Ashkenazi racism, modeling themselves on the Black Panthers. And she noted that group was very, very strongly repressed by the Israeli government. But when Mizrahi Jews created Shas, an ultra-Orthodox party, right, which didn't actually have any association with Palestinians and Arabs, that was allowed to flourish, right, because it wasn't a threat to the system. So I think that it would be really, really an amazing thing if you saw more of a kind of conversation among Jews of Arab descent about the way in which, in a reckoning with the way in which Israel's anti-Mizrahi racism has impacted the discourse among Mizrahi Jews. But we have to be honest, there are great intellectuals that take that view, but they are a very, very small minority. The current, Mizrahi Jews from Arab Muslim lands are the backbone of the Likud party, right? And they're not only politically on the right when it comes to Israel in Israel. If you look at their political behavior in France or their political behavior in LA or in Great Neck or in Deal, New Jersey, it all tends to be quite far to the right, which shows that it's an uphill battle.
Hi, my name's Tom. I'm a student at the JA School. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was a really, really fascinating speech, really intellectually engaging, humane, really morally consistent. So thank you so much for that.
Can't stop while we're ahead.
I'll do my best. So I spent about 3 or 4 months after October 7th working as a journalist, variously Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Jenin, Haifa, Jerusalem, and all around. And I came to agree and accept most of your views pretty much exact. However, I would frequently have long conversations with Israeli, friends, colleagues, even people in the IDF who I was interviewing. And I wanted to give you some of the questions that they gave to me that I never exactly had a good answer for. Yeah. So one of the first things they said is, look, what after October 7th should Israel have done? They're like, look, there's been this terrible tragedy. It's gone on for decades or whatever. But right now, we're being invaded. There's all these people who want to kill us. It's either them or us. What would the moral and humane thing to have done in Gaza been? And then there was a more sort of, philosophical question about the resolution to all this. So many people were so shocked by October 7th that they said, look, we see it this way. We gave the Palestinians Gaza to do with what they wanted, and look what they created, just this kind of terrorist hellhole state that wants to attack us the whole time. If we give the Palestinians even more autonomy or more freedom, like we give them a state in the West Bank, or heaven forbid, we, tear down the system altogether and invite them in to live next to us, it's just going to be more festering, more terrorism, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you're familiar with the argument, and I just wanted to ask how you'd respond to those two questions.
Sure. Just take the second one. I mean, I think the critical thing to understand about Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005 is that Israel didn't give Palestinians a state. there was no negotiated agreement, right? It's true that Sharon decided that he was going to withdraw Israeli settlements and soldiers from Gaza. There's a lot of evidence that actually one of the reasons he did that was to relieve the pressure that he faced at that time to continue the negotiations that had happened in 1999 and 2000, right? Because you had the Arab Peace Initiative that was trying to jumpstart the idea of negotiating towards an independent Palestinian state. You had what was called the Geneva process, in which former Israeli-Palestinian negotiators had come up with a model plan. His own chief of staff, W. Weissglass, famously said that the Gaza disengagement would be formaldehyde for the peace process, right? That it would freeze it, right? And so I don't think, and no Palestinians would have accepted. First of all, it's just important to remember that Gaza is a kind of artificial entity, right? It really, the reason there's so many Palestinians there is partly just because so many of the refugees who were expelled in 1948 were expelled to Gaza. The Palestinian National Project, right, accepted in 1988 the idea of partition into a state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. There was never a vision of Gaza itself being a state. And so that Palestine, and also Israel, although it withdrew its settlers and soldiers from within Gaza, it still maintained control of the perimeter of Gaza. It tightened that control after Hamas took power after in 2007 in the fighting that followed the 2006 elections. But from as early as the early 1990s and continuing on, Israel controlled access in and out of Gaza. So it's a little bit like a prison, right? You don't have prison guards inside the prison, but you're still controlling the perimeter of the prison and what goes in and out, right? So that was the conditions, those were the conditions that were in Gaza. It was not a good, we don't know what would happen if there was a peace agreement with Palestinians for a Palestinian state near the 1967 lines. I don't think we're probably ever going to be able to see what that happens. But I think that actually it's a very completely different dynamic when the Palestinian national leadership has to accept an agreement and it goes through negotiations and then it's blessed by the world. Israel's peace agreements have held up very well, including with Jordan and Egypt, even though the populations in both those places are very, very anti-Israel. So I just think the analogy between the disengagement from Gaza and what would happen if there was a peace agreement made to create a Palestinian state is a bad analogy. On the second point, it's a hard question to answer because it's impossible for us to imagine Israel not militarily retaliating after October 7th, because we understand, just like it would be impossible for America to not militarily retaliate after September 11th, because we understand at an emotional level that the trauma, the horror was so great, right? So what I'm going to say is not an option that would have been there for Israeli politicians to take, right? It wouldn't, there would have been no Israeli politicians who would have contemplated this. But the truth of the matter is that I would say that the way Israel should have understood October 7th was as a result of a fundamental political problem that it has, right? It was a terrible, immoral expression of violence that was rooted in a fundamental political grievance of Israel holding millions of people who lack basic rights. And if you want to make sure that a day like October 7th, I hope I never ever witness any day like that again in my life, that we never have other October 7th, you have to deal with that grievance, right? Which means you have to offer Palestinians some vision of being able to have the basic human rights that we in this room take for granted, to be the citizens of a state, right? To have free movement, to be able to elect your leaders, right? And so you need to create processes that make that vision possible. And there are different ways you could have done that, right? You could have let Marwan Barghouti out of jail, right? Marwan Barghouti is probably the person most likely to be able to unify Palestinian politics. He's not an Islamist, right? And he's someone that Israel could probably genuinely do business with if it wanted to make a deal with Palestinian political leadership. You could start withdrawing settlements deep in you could start withdrawing some of the settlements deep in the West Bank that have seized land from Palestinians and from which settlers are attacking Palestinians daily. You could say that you support the idea of either partition into a Jewish and Palestinian state, or the idea of equality, right? I mean, in one state. You could do things that would give Palestinians some vision of hope that they actually could gain their rights. Because I think one of the things that made it easier for Hamas to do what it did on October 7th. I don't say this to say that Hamas doesn't bear blame. I think that people who kill civilians bear blame for killing civilians, no matter what the circumstances they face. But I know from talking to people who grew up in Gaza, who had conversations with Hamas members who they grew up with, where the Hamas members said, listen, none of your efforts to liberate us have worked. How has it worked when you went to when you went to the United Nations, when you went to international criminal courts, when you tried boycotts, when you tried the Great March of Return? All of these efforts have been defeated, right? And I think that it is the defeating and closing down of ethical and nonviolent Palestinian methods of resistance. The more you do that, the more you're likely to get immoral acts of resistance that target civilians like we saw on October 7th. Otherwise, you're basically telling Palestinians, basically, they just need to accept their oppression in perpetuity and lay down and die, right? Which is not something that any group of human beings I think, are going to do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have various questions about sort of how we confront this within our own Jewish communities, but I'll focus in on how we confront these sort of baseless allegations of anti-Semitism. I was covering a voting station on Tuesday that was inside of a yeshiva in Gravesend, Brooklyn, and was talking to some of the yeshiva students afterwards. And they were telling me about how their families were going to move to New Jersey if Mamdani won because of fear for their lives. The fear is genuine. Its foundation is baseless. How do we confront that on a daily basis as Jews?
I mean, the problem is that we have not educated these kids, right? I mean, in the sense that it goes back to what I was saying. You're hearing about Palestinians and about their supporters always in this, always as this menace, right? Imagine how those kids might think differently if their schools had brought in a Palestinian refugee to come and talk about their life experience. So you could see this person as a human being, and you could kind of understand that that person might have pretty good reasons for not liking Israel very much, right? It doesn't mean that they hate you. It doesn't mean that they want to do violence to you. Jewish education, the institutions that educate Jewish kids almost never allow them to put themselves in Palestinians' shoes and imagine how the world looks through Palestinian eyes. And so therefore they can't understand how things look through the eyes of people who then come to identify with Palestinians and who start to feel solidarity and sympathy with Palestinians. And so I think that we've done these kids like a tremendous disservice, really. I mean, when I see some of what happens on the college campuses, I really think, so much of this would be so different if these Jewish kids, before they came to campus, in their Jewish schools or their synagogues or their youth groups or their camps or whatever, if we as a community, in a way that if we had taken it upon ourselves to actually give these kids an education in which they actually understand Palestinian history and the Palestinian experience, because it's not Students for Justice in Palestine's job to do that, right? And they're not going to do it in a particularly effective way. It's not what they're set up to do, right? The Jewish community should do that, right? Because then you either won't have kids who flip and end up in the encampment and basically are incredibly resentful at their rabbi and their Jewish day school and their synagogue, or you won't have kids who are basically cowering in fear, feeling like they need to basically barricade themselves inside the Hillel because this university is a hostile place, right? You'll actually have more kids who can actually just confidently engage and start to do the hard but like really crucial work of thinking like, what does it mean for me to live a committed Jewish life even as I face these really difficult truths about what my community and the state that speaks in my name has done? And I think the thing that gives me hope is precisely those young American Jews who are doing that work, because I actually think what they're producing as a result of that struggle is remarkable. And I think may well be produced not just a moral, but a kind of religious and spiritual renewal in American Jewish life. I mean, when I listen to the various big deal rabbis who gave Divrei Torah, attacking Zoran Mamdani. What struck me about those was not just that I thought the politics were, the arguments were had no evidence and made no sense, but the quality of the Torah was terrible. There were terrible engagements with Torah, right? And if you look by comparison at the stuff that's being produced like by networks like the Halachic Left, you see actually really fascinating, really deep, serious engagement with Torah in a way that I think actually can show people why Torah is really something worth engaging with.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just had a question going back to how you talked about members of the Jewish community sort of aligning with the current administration and the potential dangers of, an administration that is white nationalist Christian. Do you think they have the idea that they might be protected because they've been aligned for so long? Because you also pointed out that with these types of governments, a rise in discrimination or violent acts against other groups inevitably goes along with attacks against Jewish people. So do they think maybe they're in a somehow protected class, or is it a calculated decision that it's worth it to protect interests in Israel, or does it depend on
Stephen Miller is Jewish.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I think that
We have to reckon with that.
no, that's true. I mean, I think there are probably differences. I think there's some people for whom they have just decided that their job description is basically to defend it. I mean, most extremely AIPAC, right? I mean, AIPAC is the most powerful American Jewish organization. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it and you step back and against the backdrop of American Jewish history. The most powerful American Jewish organization very explicitly says that it takes no position whatsoever on what happens in the United States, including whether America remains a free country. Its only criteria for judging politicians is whether they unconditionally support Israel. So they've basically said, like, not our job, right, whether America survives as a democracy.
And so even if Jews living in America would suffer eventually down the road, if we, because if we follow the logic of how that would play out,
yes,
it wouldn't, but just the ultimate prioritization of Israel.
But I think there are other people, and Stephen Miller is a good example, who genuinely do believe, they probably believe that, immigrants, Muslims, black people are Jew haters, or more disproportionately Jew haters, and that the white Christian evangelicals love Jews, and that and those people are embracing Jews as long as Jews basically go along with their project, right? The Judeo-Christian project, and that's they want to. And they have racist views themselves towards those groups, and they feel like they want to be part of that project. I mean, when I look at Stephen Miller, I'm often reminded of someone who I learned about growing up, who was a man named Percy Uttar, as a South African, or a child of South African. So in 1964, at the Rivonia trial, when Mandela was convicted and sent to Robben Island, sent to jail for 27 years, all of the white defendants at the Rivonia trial were Jews. And South African Jews tend to like to talk about that. But they talk less about the fact that the prosecutor was Jewish as well. He was the Deputy Attorney General of the Transvaal province, and he was, unlike the Jewish communists in the ANC who had nothing to do with the institutional Jewish community, he was the president of a large Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg. And Percy Uttar believed that Afrikaners, many of whom had been pro-Nazi during World War II, had essentially decided that Jews were white and that Jews could be part of this project. And he felt grateful to them and grateful for the success that he'd had in his work. And he wanted to repay that and show that Jews would be good allies of this effort. So I think Stephen Miller is, in a way, in that tradition. About where, and that I think my guess would be, if you look carefully, I mean, we all talk about Heschel, right, going to the South for civil rights, but Heschel was, there was a whole delegation of Southern rabbis who told Heschel that he was endangering them by going south, right? So I think Jews have always been on different sides of this. And I think that we see a new form, a very old kind of Jewish debate, which is, do you gain safety by allying with those in power, right? Or do you gain safety by allying with a broader coalition of people who band together in the principle that they will keep each other safe by defending everybody's right to be treated equally?
Thank you very
Hi, thank you. I feel like I share a similar privilege that you do in my anti-Zionism, but I do have one particularly bad personal circumstance, which I was raised in the South, and a lot of my family, deep Southerners, very poor. I got a very strange phone call the other day. My cousin, who I haven't spoken to in years, told me, "Hey, I'm really sorry about the whole space laser thing. After listening to so much Charlie Kirk, I've realized that, Zionism is a curse." And that was a wild thing for me to hear on a Sunday morning over coffee. And after sort of unpacking it for a little bit, I'm realizing that we're kind of getting into a very dangerous situation with very dangerous bedfellows at the moment. Wondered if you have thoughts.
Yes, I think this is a really important point you're making. If you look at the work of Eitan Hirsch at Tufts, who I think has done the best work, or at least the best work that I've seen, on looking at anti-Semitic attitudes and ideology, he doesn't say that there isn't an overlap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. What he finds is that you do find that overlap on the right, particularly among young people on the right. You don't find it much on the left, but you find it much more on the right. And I think that is because I think the right is not equality and human rights oriented, right? And so when it turns against Israel, from a kind of a white Christian perspective, it's not as likely to make a distinction between Israel and Jews, right? And you see this in Nick Fuentes, you see this in Candace Owen, you see it now to some degree in Tucker Carlson, and it's very, very disturbing. I mean, it's very disturbing, and I think that it's going to be very, very challenging for people who want to change U.S. policy towards Israel and end unconditional U.S. support for Israel to figure out how to deal with these people. Because as a practical political matter, if you want to, say, implement the Leahy Law, which would say that the U.S. can't send weapons to any country in the world, including Israel, if there are units in those militaries that are committing grave human rights abuses, you're going to be much more successful if you have Republican votes, right? But part of what is producing this shift in the Republican Party is a form of anti-Zionism that does cross into anti-Semitism. I mean, and if you listen to these people, you just see it. I mean, it's weird to listen to. I mean, because these people say they say some things that are actually, I think, totally legitimate, They talk about human rights abuses in Gaza. They talk about the fact that, AIPAC has too much influence in American politics. And then next thing you know, they're talking about the Talmud, or about Jewish pedophiles, or about how Jews are persecuting Christians. It's very, very problematic. And I think, this in some ways is this is going to be a really, really difficult thing, I think, for people to reckon with, yeah.
Thank you. We're out of time, but maybe just do all three questions at once, or we'll just listen.
Hi, my name's Jake. My question was if you've been able to mend any relationships that were damaged or shattered by the events of October 7th and the radicalization in both directions after that event.
Hi, my name is Fatima, and you mentioned the anti-Semitism definition that Columbia adopted, right? And last year I happened to be in conversation with someone who's part of the anti-Semitism task force who was involved in making that definition. And, I countered him on the fact that there's this clear conflation between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, and he said, oh, but Fatima, there are so many Jews who do feel that critiquing Israel is an insult to their faith and to them. And then what do you say about that? They get to determine what is anti-Semitic and not you. And it's then you enter this weird terrain of feelings, right? Which is just this amorphous mass of something that you can't really rationally argue with. And I was wondering how to challenge that. And just connected to that, I like that I felt that your journey of being more critical of Israel kind of overlapped with your journey of becoming a more committed Jewish person. And I was wondering if the way to sort of mobilize the community, especially the younger people in the Jewish community, is to say that, hey, this isn't you being more liberal, but this is just you being more Jewish. and by you being more Jewish, you should be against Israel, and using religion as a tool as opposed to something that's distracting. And just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, my question would be, given how responsible has been the mainstream media in justifying and enabling and protecting Israel's and the narratives that then enable the genocide, and given also that we are at the J School with a bunch of student journalists pitching left and right, including myself, do we still pitch to these places? What do you tell your students? How do you deal with a media that has so fundamentally failed, at least on that sphere, but not only? What do you do? Because you want your pieces to be read,
right,
and you don't want to put it to the chore, but at the same time...
I think it's a great question. I mean, I do believe that the mainstream media has really fundamentally failed, and that there's, fundamentally it's failed. Most fundamentally not platforming Palestinians, you can't cover this story in an educated, informed, and humane way without centering the voices of the people who are being destroyed. But very rarely does that take place. I mean, I would say if you can do the pieces that you want to do, that you think are good journalism, and those places will publish them, then I think you should do so. Because you want to get those pieces in front of that kind of audience. But you'll have to. So I wouldn't prophylactically say, well, I can never do the kind of journalism I want for these publications. I would test the proposition and try. If you can't, then you can't, and then you're not going to do work that you don't believe is good work or is ethical. But I think you want to try to keep knocking on the door and see what happens. On the question of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, I mean, to me, one of the most depressing things about these various universities have adopted this is that it's so unscholarly. Right? I mean, one of the things the university has at its disposal is a lot of scholars who actually study anti-Semitism and study Israel and Palestine. And so you have a lot of people you can turn to who are experts on these things, right? And you can say, okay, we want to think about how we define anti-Semitism. But in most cases, the people who are put on these anti-Semitism task forces are not put there because they have a scholarly background on anti-Semitism, let alone on Israel and Palestine, right? If you wanted to have that conversation and Pavis Putin, have Mark Mazur and Rashid Khalidi and Yinon Cohen, and you have a lot of people that I think could do good work. But basically what you find is that the people who get to be on these task forces are people who have political views that are closer to the views of big donors, the boards of trustees, and politicians, and so it's just an embarrassment from a scholarly perspective. I mean, the guy who was put in charge of the University of Pennsylvania's task force on anti-Semitism was the head of the dental school, right? I mean, I'm sure he's deeply knowledgeable about orthodontics or whatever, but why is he running an anti-Semitism task force, right? Use the scholarly paraphernalia at your disposal to actually do a scholarly report on these things. But that's not what I think was going on, right? And it's identity politics of the worst kind to suggest that the way you define anti-Semitism is to say, well, this is what some Jews believe anti-Semitism is, right? First of all, lots of other Jews don't believe, because many of the students and faculty around the country who are suffering and being expelled, suspended, losing their jobs because they're supposedly complicit in anti-Semitism are Jewish themselves, right? I mean, when Columbia suspended Jewish Voice for Peace, I noticed that the Anti-Defamation League put out a tweet thanking Columbia for keeping Jewish students safe, right? Well, not those Jewish students, their group just got suspended, right? So it's based on this kind of myth of a monolith of a Jewish community. And yeah, I mean, if it's anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist, because many Jews find that offensive, then is it anti-Palestinian bigotry to be a Zionist? Because it's surely the case that many Palestinians find Zionism to be bigoted, right? So does that mean that basically you have a definition of anti-Palestinian bigotry? These things fall apart, right, once you actually think about the fact that Palestinians might also have rights and feelings that need to be brought into this conversation. So to me, I mean, for some Jews, the way to rethink this may be greater degree of investment in Judaism, but it doesn't. There are many others for whom it may be other things. I mean, it may come from a more universalistic place. It may be a connection to more secular Jewish traditions that are not Zionist, that are more, with accordance with, universalistic, principles of justice and equality. So there are a number of different ways in. On the question of mending relationships, I guess I would say that I haven't had a lot of success with that, unfortunately. I have been able to maintain relationships with people who I care about a lot where we don't discuss this issue. There's just an understanding that this is not part of our relationship, and we've managed to do that. It's a little strange sometimes. I have one very, very close and dear friend who tells me proudly that he's never read anything I've written on this subject. And sometimes I feel like that's a kind of like a moral capitulation in some ways, but I guess I feel like, many of us have complicated relationships with people, especially people in our families or very deep friendships that are based on a lot of different things. And I don't think everything needs to have a political criteria. There's plenty of time in all of our lives to fight for the causes that we want to fight for, and I don't think we have to fight for those beliefs in every interaction we have and in every setting, especially when the likely effect is going to be to destroy relationships without actually doing anything to actually convince anybody.
Peter Beinart, everybody, thank you.